A tēnei au ko te uri o manu ko te aitanga tiki, he matākahi he manuka he kāhika. Iahu mai te kohanga tapu āti te whare o te manuka i te wharekura manuka pūwa. Tēnei au te hoatu nei hoka i āwai whanāringa. Hiko ia te whetū, hiko ia te marama ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama. Whāno, haramai te tōki haumi e. Hui e, tai ki e. A tēnā koutou. Ngā waka, ngā rangatira, ngā iwi katoa, hui mai nei i tēnei wehenga o tāmaki makaurau, tāmaki here ngā waka. Nau mai. Hara mai ki tēnei wehenga i ngā take o puke matakiao, i te wā o nui o tiriwā, i te taha o ngā oa, o pānuku, waukumete, e rere atu nei ki te waitumata, nau mai, piki mai, hara mai. Hara mai ki tēnei wehenga o taku whanaunga o te kaura wāmaki, tēnei wāhi te tūtakinga o rātou, kia mātou o Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. Nō reira, ka tika ka mihi ki a rātou o te kaura wāmaki, o tirā ki a tātou, ko hui mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. E tika ana ki te mihi atu ki ngā tini aitua ki rungi a tātou i tēnei rā, haere ngā mate. Te rangatira, te manu taupua, Rudi, Ngāti Korokoro, ngā puhi nui tonu, ko hinga nei, haere atu rā. Te ringa kaha o te rōpū reipa, Rudi, moi mai rā. Hoki atu anō, kia tātou ngā kānohi ora a tēnā koutou. Ka huri aku mihi ki te Premier, te whetū kōtahi, ko tai mai nei, Jacinda, te mema mo Wairaka, te kānohi, mō tātou katoa, puta no i te ao, tēnā koe, nau mai hoki mai, ngā mihi ki a koe, mō tō mahi, hei patu te huaketo, hei tiaki a tātou katoa, ka taia tātou te hui pēnei ai. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe te rangatira. Ki a koe, te koromatua, Phil, tēnei te mihi a Ngāti Whātua ki a koe, ki a tātou katoa, ko hui mai nei, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa, ka huri. On behalf of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, I would like to welcome everybody here to this part of our beautiful tāmaki makaurau, here in the foothills of Te Waonui Tiriwā, the great realm, the great forests of Tiriwā, and I acknowledge our whanaunga, our relations of Te Kawerau Āmaki, and in particular this place here, the meeting place at Kopupaka, where we would meet them as Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei in close relations to them. I acknowledge also our Prime Minister, the whetū kotahi, the one star shining, and acknowledge her work in being able to create a situation where we can hui like this today, where others in the world can't meet like this. So also encourage her and all of us, as we have patu te huaketo, gotten rid of COVID or managed it, that we turn our same efforts and attentions into solving some of the issues around homelessness and so on that are facing our country right now, and hopefully this conference will also provide some answers to. Ka te ake mo tēnei wā, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Take a moment. What have you learned in all of this? What new path are you going to take? For me, it's about new beginnings. I'm not going to eat. I'm going to taste. Taste every mouthful. I'm going to breathe in the salty air of our moana. And I'm going to take care of our maunga. I'm going to embrace the little things and the big. I'm going to keep supporting local. And I'm going to say yes to every experience. I'm going to watch the night sky, watch the dolphins and the whales. I'm going to meet friends. Make new friends and support my whānau. their businesses, our livelihood. I'm going to innovate and invigorate. I'm going to open the doors, discover something new. I'm going to go to that island, visit that beach, and I'm going to protect Papatūānuku and embrace all she's given us. I'm going to tell my mates to come, to see for themselves how beautiful our region is. Because after all, this unique view, well, it can change your whole perspective. Kia ora, tāmaki makaurau.
Tēnā koutou katoa, e te mana whenua Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei me te manukura a Ngarimu, tēnā koutou, e rangatira mā ki a koutou, e whakahuihui mai ki kōnei i te āhuatango te rānei, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ko Miriam Makamo, tōku ingoa, ko Kaitahu me Ngāti Mutunga, o kuiwi nāreire te iwi, tēnei te mihi nunui ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Well, good morning, everyone. I am delighted to welcome everyone, 800 of you, here to ReBuilding Nations New Zealand's award-winning infrastructure event. Let's just reflect on that for a moment. There are 800 of us in this room, sitting closely together. And we know that as the world, so much of the world remains in lockdown, that this is really a luxury. So let's soak up every moment of this time that we have together and look forward to the discussions that we're able to have in this space together, especially as we've gone so long without seeing each other. It didn't come easy. We've had to move this date 3 times, so it's wonderful to be able to finally host the event in a hybrid fashion, both in person and online, so it's a big hello to our online audience as well. I am Miriam Makamo. I am delighted to be your MC for the next 2 days. As we look to the challenges ahead, so challenges that predate this current crisis by a long shot. Perhaps this climate of pause gives us a space and impetus to refresh, reimagine, and crucially, to rebuild what is needed, and ideally in a way that doesn't upset Auckland Central's barbershops. And on that note, the man who will have to get his haircuts out here in the West from now on, please welcome the Mayor of Auckland, e te Mayor o te Kaunihira o Tāmaki Makaurau, Phil Goff.
Reo, e ora rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ki nā mana whenua, Ngāti Whātua o Ōrākei, tēnā koutou. Ki nā hoe whā, no mai, haere mai, ki Tāmaki Makaurau. And good morning and welcome to Auckland. It's really fantastic to see a crowd like this here at the Trust's Arena. And I want to congratulate Infrastructure New Zealand for attracting a record crowd, I think, of over 800 people. And the first thing to celebrate today is the fact that we are all here together. In how many countries in the world could we have a gathering of this nature as COVID-19 continues to ravage the globe with more than 52 million people infected and over 1 million dead? And that fact that we are celebrating today is a triumph of both leadership, and I thank our Prime Minister for providing that leadership, but a triumph also for our collective endeavour to continue to defeat the spread through community transmission of COVID-19. At the same time as celebrating that, we cannot ignore the fact that there have been serious related social and economic costs caused by a combination of an international recession initiated by COVID-19, caused by the lockdowns that we have had to endure and caused by the closure of our borders. Jobs, incomes and businesses have been lost, and the government has had to borrow at an unprecedented level in order to counteract what would otherwise have been the severe recessionary impact of COVID-19. Clearly, they don't have the indefinite ability to continue to borrow. From an Auckland Council point of view, the impact of COVID-19, as for many businesses around our city, has been severe. We're somewhat different as a council in that 60% of our income comes from revenue sources other than rates. And the loss of dividends from Auckland International Airport Limited, the ports, the loss of transport revenue with a lower patronage of public transport, the loss of revenue from our venues, the loss of regulatory income, means that we face this year a hole in our budget of something around $450 million. Continued over the next 3 years with the ongoing impact of COVID-19, that is close to a $1 billion hole. As a result, our council has had to shed staff, we've had to become a leaner organisation, we've had to make sure that we deliver our services in a different way, and to a degree we have had to reduce our expenditure on capital projects. But up against this adversity, what we have succeeded in doing is continuing to deliver the key services that we need and continuing to make the investment that our city, a growth city, needs in the infrastructure that sustains life in the city. And this year, our investment will be about, from council funds, that is, $2.5 billion, which is less than we wanted to spend before COVID-19 affected our finances, but considerably up on the average of the last 5 years, which has been about $1.6 billion. So we are continuing to spend on infrastructure because there is that backlog of need in transport and housing infrastructure and environmental infrastructure, but it is still not enough. Our biggest risk, as I'm sure you're all aware, is until a vaccine is widely available, there may be a further incursion of COVID-19 that will not be able to be managed in the way that we have to date. That would have a devastating impact because of the need for any lockdown on both our city and the businesses in it. On a positive side, we've not suffered the massive increase in unemployment that was predicted at the start of COVID-19. But because we are the gateway city to New Zealand, we have suffered a higher rate of unemployment than elsewhere in the country. 29% of our workforce is engaged, or 29% of the tourist workforce in New Zealand is engaged, that is engaged in tourism, and hospitality is based here in our city. A big percentage, 3/4 of our international students in New Zealand are in our city. And because we've had longer lockdowns at level 3 and level 2, our city has been particularly hard hit. And I know the Prime Minister is just behind the stage and listening, so I have to pass on a small message to her that further investment by the government in infrastructure, and in particular in our city, would be most welcome. No pressure, Prime Minister. The parts of our economy, however, are doing really well. And the great news that I got last week was that our September building consents were the highest ever on record in our city. And in the year to September, consents reached 15,470, which is an all-time record. That is particularly important to us because by continuing to build housing and the infrastructure associated with it, we are dealing with the accumulated result of underinvestment in infrastructure that has led to a housing shortage. Housing affordability, however, with the predictions of a 7.5% drop in house prices, we've had the reverse, a 13% increase in house prices continues to be a problem. So I wish you well for your conference as you look at how we can develop the infrastructure that this city, a third of the country's population, and our country needs. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Last month, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern created history in being the first Prime Minister since MMP was introduced back in 1996 to win an outright majority of votes in our nation. It is a tribute to her leadership and her ability to communicate clearly and to carry the nation with her, in particular during the crises caused by the mosque attacks on March 15 last year and dealing with the COVID pandemic. She has justifiably won acknowledgement from around the world, and she has helped build a reputation for our nation as being stable, well-governed, and a decent place, a great place in which to live, to invest, and to visit when the opportunity comes back to us. Please join with me in welcoming our Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern. Thank you very much.
Te whare I tūnei te marae e tā koto ana tina koroa. I ne mātai maha, haere, haere, haere. Nā tangara whenua o Tīnei Rohi o Ngāti Whātua o Ōrākei, tēnā koutou. Tātou nā kānohi e hui mai ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and join you today. Thank you, Mayor Goff, for the welcome and the introduction. I can assure you we will both sanitise after our contact greeting. Thank you to the organisers who have done such an amazing job of working to make sure this event could happen, but also looking after everyone while you're all here as well. And before I start my substantive comments, I do want to acknowledge that it is the hard work of everyone that has allowed us to be here today. You know, before 2020, I'm mindful that we would have called this a conference. Now we call it a mass gathering. And we are amongst only a few countries in the world that is privileged enough to continue to have them. Now, I don't take that for granted, and I know that none of you do either. But that is not to say that our path here has been simple, or that the job is done. COVID-19 will be with us for some time to come. We will need to be vigilant for some time to come. But despite that, we cannot afford to wait for things to get easier before we start our recovery. Our response and our rebuild need to happen at the same time, and that is exactly what we are doing. That's why we have already laid out a plan, and we are already, as a government, getting on with it. It's a plan that has 5 elements. Many of you will have heard me repeat them over the last few months. Elections do tend to turn politicians into broken records. So I'll give you the very short version. It includes investing in our people, job creation, supporting our small businesses, backing our exporters, and preparing and investing in our future. Under each of these headings lie specific policies and programs, things like the wage subsidy, which ensured 1.7 million New Zealanders were supported to stay in their jobs. The small business loan scheme, which I know has a high uptake from businesses in the construction industry, and is designed to support smaller operators through this period of uncertainty. And our Freeze Trades Training and Apprenticeship Support Program, which is seeing a significant lift and those moving into vocational education. I'll be giving a little bit of an update on those figures later today. The early signs are that our plan is making a difference. In a world where there is no cost-free response to COVID-19, we are certainly minimising some of the impacts as much as we can. For example, you would have heard in recent weeks, unemployment at 5.3% is well below the more than 9% that was predicted at the time of the budget. It puts us below Australia, who's sitting at about 6.9%, and the OECD average of 7.4%. There are other green shoots of recovery. Merchandise exports since 1 February were higher than in 2019. We saw expansion in the manufacturing and services sector in September, and consumer and business confidence, given the circumstances, are holding up. But there is much more to do, especially on that last area of the plan that I mentioned, the idea of preparing and investing in our future, using this time and opportunity to address challenges like climate change, inequality, our skills gap, and our housing crisis. I don't need to tell you that any recovery plan for New Zealand cannot and should not be a return to the status quo. And when it comes to the status quo and infrastructure, it's fair to say that New Zealand has long struggled. The World Economic Forum found in 2019 that New Zealand ranked first out of 141 economies for macroeconomic stability, third for the quality of our institutions, and fifth for our labour market, but 46th for the state of our infrastructure. And while estimates vary, prior to COVID-19, our infrastructure deficit has been estimated to be between $25.9 and $75 billion. That's the equivalent to the cost of up to 17 Auckland rail link projects. Now, those numbers don't tell the full story, though. They're not just numbers that make for an interesting report, they are having an impact on people's daily lives. Whether it's the 30,000 houses in Auckland that Infometrics predicts that we are short of, the lack of adequate access in some parts of the country to safe drinking water, or significant congestion issues that contribute to poor productivity. The impact in our day-to-day lives is clear, and that's why our recovery plan cannot and is not about a return to the status quo. It's about taking a crisis and turning it into a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build back better. To address decades of underinvestment, to build the infrastructure the next generation needs and deserves, and to do it together, in partnership with local government, the private sector, and with iwi. But first, we need a very honest assessment of what has led us to where we are today. Now, that assessment is not going to provide one simple silver bullet that, if unleashed, would resolve all of the problems successive governments have faced. I can assure you that politicians are virtual magnets when it comes to silver bullets. If there was one, we would have found it by now. But first, as a nation, we haven't been ones for long-term planning. It's probably cruel to recall that we were the city that built a harbour bridge and less than 10 years later had to clip on some extra capacity, but it does make the point. Local government would also probably argue that our regulatory environment creates a disincentive to pursue large-scale or ambitious projects. And that's before you factor in the funding constraints of an ever-decreasing rating base in some of the areas where those critical infrastructure needs exist. We then have the skills deficit, a procurement environment that's led in some cases to a race to the bottom, challenges with the RMA, and the need for a pipeline of work to maintain capacity in the construction industry. Add that all together, and you can start to see why, as a nation, we have struggled. But you can also see the solutions. This list of challenges is why we created the Infrastructure Commission, to provide the long-term planning that we hope overcomes the short-term political cycles that we have in New Zealand. It's why we worked collaboratively on the Construction Sector Accord to overcome some of the issues around procurement. It's why we have moved to a multi-year capital allowance to make sure we're moving past an annual budget process for larger scale and longer term investment plans for areas like health and education. It's why we have supported local government to have greater flexibility in the way they fund the cost of infrastructure over the lifetime of an asset. It's why we've embarked on a massive piece of work to reform our resource management legislation. It's why we've tried to move beyond the boom and bust cycles for residential building through government-backed underwrites. And critically, it's why we have worked so hard to support skills and trade training, with incentives that support employers to keep on apprentices and wage subsidies to help them take them on too. We learnt from the GFC and we don't want that same loss of skills. Now, we will all be amongst the first to admit that in some of these areas it is early days. The work needs to bed in, and in some cases the work will be ongoing for some time to come. But my hope is that you'll see from this list an absolute awareness from us of the issues that you have been raising with us directly and a commitment to resolving them. In the meantime, we know an ongoing program of work will also drive change, and there is no shortage of that. In the last term, we set an unprecedented infrastructure program. Even before COVID, we were determined to address that long-term underinvestment in infrastructure and to drive outcomes that were, yes, about jobs, but were also about greater public transport options, rebuilding public services, and generally contributing to our goals around decarbonisation. In February, which feels approximately a lifetime ago for all of us, we announced the New Zealand Upgrade Program, and that we are investing $6.8 billion in transport projects to get our cities moving and boost productivity in our country's growth areas. The program will also play a vital role in helping to stimulate the economy, providing a pipeline of work for the construction industry and professional services, but will also support a shift to greater transport choice with balanced investment in public transport, roads, walking and cycling. Add to that the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, Let's Get Wellington Moving, and the increase in the National Land Transport Program. Then we have the Education Growth and Redevelopment Programs. Now, Minister Chris Hipkins will be sharing a bit more information about that tomorrow, a bit of an update, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But I don't think he'll mind if I share that it is a very large and tangible demonstration of our commitment to provide new and upgraded classrooms that will obviously benefit students, but also continue to provide that ongoing employment. The Health Capital Program, estimated to be $3.9 billion across 4 years, is also linked to projects like the Dunedin Hospital, the biggest build we have seen in this country in the health sector. The New Zealand Defence Force has a $4.5 billion capital program. In the housing sector, we're working to address both under supply and inequality. We've committed to 18,000 additional public and transitional houses by 2024. And for local government, we have $760 million investment in Three Waters to help councils upgrade water services across New Zealand. Not all of our investment is large scale, not all of it is in our cities. We're being mindful of spreading opportunities across the country. That's why the COVID response program also included investment in community infrastructure such as the Blenheim Library and Art Gallery, Kaikoura Aquatic Centre, even Auckland City Mission's new ground building, which will provide detox beds and housing for some of our most vulnerable. All of this is also before you consider the areas where we're embarking on business cases, such as the New Zealand Battery Project. The New Zealand Battery study we have funded is looking into how we can store renewable energy for those dry hydrological years that New Zealand is subject to. And beyond that, how we can get our electricity grid to 100% renewable energy. Investigation of pumped hydro was a key recommendation of the Interim Climate Commission to help us meet our climate goals. Additionally, it has the potential to provide a huge pipeline of work and jobs. All up, and this is a far from complete list, this amounts to a plan for infrastructure that demonstrates just how central it is to our rebuild, our recovery, and to building back better. We have a huge opportunity. And I know you in the room here today are just as committed as we are to working together, to not just surviving through this period, but to finding a way to thrive, to fix the issues we've long faced, build infrastructure that supports the well-being of New Zealanders, and leave a legacy for our country, for our children, and for our grandchildren. So let's get on with it. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Well, a big thanks to the Prime Minister who said we don't want to return to the status quo because the status quo wasn't working on too many levels, so we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build anew. She laid out the issues, many of which will be discussed, of course, today, and her ambitions for resolving them. And, of course, we had the Mayor, Phil Goff, who, as you heard, directly asked the Prime Minister for more infrastructure funding. So another round of applause, please, for the Prime Minister and the Mayor. Okay, so it's fitting that we should follow the Prime Minister with some important health and safety messages for you. There are, as we've said, 800 of you here, and we were reminded recently that we aren't necessarily guaranteed of gatherings like this into the future. We are operating in a COVID level 1 event, and we do not want this conference to be a super spreader event. So we're taking all precautions. So please, everyone, if you wouldn't mind turning to the person next to you and repeating after me. Find your partner, and please say to them, please use the hand sanitizer. Thank you. And then actually use the hand sanitizer. So what we're asking you to do, ladies and gentlemen, is use the hand sanitizer as much as you can today, frankly. Every time you use the water jug, sanitize your hands. Every time you sit down at a table or help yourself to food, please use the hand sanitizer. And here's the thing. Although we know it's been a long time since so many of us have seen each other, we know there's a lot of excitement to be together, we're asking you to please not shake each other's hands. I know that goes against everything that feels natural to us, but we would prefer that you did not shake hands, and we ask that you don't, so that we reduce that risk going forward. For those of you who would like a mask, please ask at the registration desk. And while we're at it, a few more housekeeping notes for you. Bathrooms are located in the foyer behind the Rawlinson's Shoe Shine booth. Rawlinson's Shoe Shine booth, try saying that fast 5 times, and outside the Genesis room upstairs. Emergency exits are located across the side of the room here to the right. If there is any emergency, let's all meet in the car park. Wai te whānau, I'd like to now invite to the stage the Chair of Infrastructure New Zealand, Andrew Stevens.
Get up, get on up, get up, get on up, stay on the scene, get on up, like a sex machine, get on up, get up, get on up.
It's a little embarrassing. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, g'day, and welcome to Rebuilding Nations. First, let me acknowledge Ngāti Whātua and the opening mihi from Ngarimu, Blair. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, thank you for taking the time this morning, sharing your aspirations for the new government. I was surprised she went into the details and didn't leave all of that to Grant, but we'll hear from him later. I also acknowledge Mayor Goff and the other officials and ministers in attendance today. To our MC Miriama, thank you for bringing your energy and vigour to Rebuilding Nations this year. We are delighted to have you MC our conference which last month won the Best Corporate Event for 2019 at the New Zealand Events Industry Awards Night. So well done to the team. It's such a great feeling to be standing up here welcoming you all ahead of what is going to be our largest conference and most comprehensive program ever. The ups and downs of this year have been challenging for us all, and there were certainly times we had doubts, even last Friday, that we could actually hold this event in person. But here we are, and what a crowd. All 866 of you. Well done. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed many things we thought we knew, creating an immense set of challenges and simultaneously opening the door to opportunity. The opportunity to rethink how we do things and in turn create a more sustainable, productive and equitable economy and society if we do it right. I'm really excited to reimagine what we can do as a country and how we can use this crisis to really unlock New Zealand's potential. I hope you are too. Okay, over the next 2 days, you will hear from some of New Zealand's brightest minds in infrastructure planning, funding, management and delivery as they share their perspectives on how New Zealand can seize on this crisis and build back better. I sincerely hope you enjoy the debate and networking, and I look forward to catching up with many of you over the next couple of days. I'd like to encourage you to introduce yourselves to our Infrastructure New Zealand board members, pictured above. This has been a really tough year for Infrastructure New Zealand and our board and our management team. And I'm really proud of the way that as a group we stepped up. We have distinctive yellow lanyards to make it easier to identify the board members. We're special, of course. So please take the time to say hello. In this year of heightened uncertainty, I want to extend particular thanks to all our valued sponsors, especially our premier sponsor, ANZ. Without your continued sponsor support, there is no way we could deliver a conference of this calibre and scale. And yes, it is scary how big it gets every year. This year, more than ever, your commitment has been hugely important to us, and we thank you for that. Okay then, we have a fantastic and full program to get through. So I'd like to welcome Stuart McKinnon, Managing Director Institutional at our sponsor ANZ, to open our first session on transformative leadership.
Tēnā koutou katoa, kua mai nei tēnei wā. Good morning everyone, and thank you Andrew for that introduction. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, and Mayor of Auckland, the Honourable Phil Goff, and thank you for your welcoming remarks and encouragement to all of us here. I'd also like to acknowledge all other distinguished guests and all conference delegates from across the industry. ANZ continues to be a proud sponsor of this event, and given the impressive lineup of speakers we have here over the next couple of days, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great discussion on how we can influence and shape the future of New Zealand. There's no doubt that 2020 has been a tough year for all of us, and it's also a real challenge to look beyond COVID-19 and ensure the decisions we make today not only benefit us, but also generations to come. It's a challenge because we're unable to transport ourselves into the future to see what the outcomes of these decisions will be. But we can look to the past to help us understand what success could look like. On March the 25th, when New Zealand first went into lockdown, COVID-19 was about to test our broadband infrastructure like nothing has ever tested it before. As our cities and towns emptied out, the internet filled up. The only safe way of interacting with the world outside our bubbles was online, and millions of Kiwis switched to working, learning, running businesses, shopping and communicating online. And ANZ is a really good example of this. As you know, banking is an essential service. We had to do our bit to keep the economy going and provide secure and reliable services for our customers. It was crucial that our staff were able to do that safely, and in the space of a few days, we had over 5,000 of them set up to work from home. Apart from a handful of branches operating on reduced hours and essential staff who had to be in our corporate sites, we pretty much ran our entire New Zealand business from homes around the country. This certainly highlighted just how important reliable broadband is. When it comes to broadband infrastructure, we've always viewed this as an essential part of bringing us closer to the rest of the world. As a small trading nation, so far from global markets, that long-term thinking has been critical. Collectively, it's meant we've remained focused on the end goal, not the project. Previous government investments and interventions have proved incredibly valuable, and these have been supported by smart and dedicated private sector investment. It was only a couple of decades ago that one company owned all the phone lines, and there were only 2 mobile networks here in New Zealand. In 2006, Labor made changes and introduced competition by allowing other telcos to sell products and services using telecoms network. And then in 2008, National announced it would invest $1.5 billion to roll out the ultra-fast broadband network. Because of this, we now have a mature and competitive telecommunications market with 3 network operators and a quality nationwide broadband network. Our connection to the internet and the rest of the world is via 35,000 kilometres of fibre optic cables on the ocean floor. And this ensures we have good quality, cost-effective, dependable and secure connectivity. Without this, our telecommunications landscape wouldn't have been able to develop as it has. The Southern Cross Next project that is currently underway will expand our capacity even further. A significant 2-year build and spanning multiple jurisdictions, the Southern Cross Next project will also connect parts of the Pacific with high-speed internet for the first time, opening up numerous benefits and opportunities. This is a critical factor in future-proofing us and our connection to the world. But submarine cables like this are expensive and costly infrastructure projects with returns over a long time frame. Without the availability of private sector investment, projects like this may not be prioritised or delivered as originally intended. ANZ is proud to have supported this project through our partnership with Southern Cross. As we look to recover and rebuild in the wake of COVID-19, our global connectivity can continue to help us turn geographic distance into an opportunity by further exporting our talent and innovation across a number of sectors. New Zealand's telecommunications sector is an example of where we got it right, and for once we aren't playing catch-up. So what can we learn from this? Over the past 3 years, the government has largely focused on setting the framework and groundwork for how they will deliver infrastructure. They've committed $12 billion to critical infrastructure projects throughout the country across rail, road, housing, schools and hospitals. On top of this, another $3 billion of spending was announced in July from the COVID Response and Recovery Fund. We now have an infrastructure commission developing a 30-year plan, and we're repealing and replacing the Resource Management Act. All this alongside a renewed focus and urgency to get shovel-ready projects underway to create jobs and drive economic growth. This is great to see and will play a key role as New Zealand recovers from the impacts of COVID. It's also important that this investment improves productivity and is designed and delivered with a sustainable lens. If we get this right, infrastructure could be the vaccine our COVID-19 ailing economy desperately needs, while future-proofing us against further shocks. It's important the private sector also plays a role in this 30-year plan, and at ANZ we're keen to play our part. Working together with a strategic vision, innovation and discipline, the decisions we make today will deliver long-term prosperity for generations to come. We have the right platform, alignment, capability and desire, and it's now up to all of us to play our part. As mentioned earlier, ANZ is proud to be the premier sponsor of this event, and as a leader in developing the infrastructure financing market in New Zealand, we are keen to play our part in supporting the acceleration of infrastructure investment to help the regeneration of New Zealand's economy in the coming years. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the conference, and congratulations to Andrew and the Infrastructure New Zealand team for once again organising and hosting such an important event. Thank you.
Well, another round of applause, please, for our Premier sponsor, Stuart McKinnon, also Andrew Stevens. So we have some particularly important thank yous before we start, given the challenging financial environment that we find ourselves in. ANZ, you have been our long-term premier sponsor, and we sincerely thank you for your ongoing loyalty and support. To our gala dinner sponsors, BNZ, thank you. We know the dinner tonight will be a highlight for many. And to our gold sponsors, EY, Fletchers, Westpac and Beca, thank you all for your significant contributions to rebuilding nations. We are absolutely delighted to have you on board this year. We'd also like to acknowledge every single one of our 39 sponsors this year. Thank you for stepping up to support us in the crazy year that 2020 has been. In addition to our major sponsors, we'd also like to acknowledge Fulton Hogan, who have, as you may have seen, welded an innovative fruit bucket for us, which is in the foyer. They've also provided the centerpieces on the table. Fletchers, thank you for your building materials for our spectacular construction art pieces made by our theme is Cut the Mustard, and also to Maureen for helping on the registration desk. Thank you. And just quietly, we'd also like to acknowledge the athletics club next door who lent us the wee mini cones that you can see in the middle of each of your tables, and we've flicked a donation to the club by way of support. So round of applause, please, for all of our sponsors. So as you know, the theme for this year's conference is Rebuilding Nations, Building Back Better, and who better to set the scene for us and tell us how to do it best is Professor Greg Clark. We're very lucky we have him live from the UK. A round of applause, please, for Professor Greg Clark.
Well, good morning to you all from London. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'm only so sorry I can't be with you there in Auckland to celebrate this conference together with you. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to speak to you, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional welcome that was provided at the beginning of the day. Now, there are two key questions I'm going to try to address with you today. One is, what will be the long-term impacts of COVID-19? And the second one is really about what this means for infrastructure, and particularly for the role of infrastructure in how it supports communities, how it supports economies, but also how it supports transitions. Now, in order to address this properly, it's important to go back to where we were just before the crisis began. One way of looking at this is to say that New Zealand was already one of the most highly urbanized countries in the world. Its bigger cities, particularly Auckland, Wellington, and indeed Christchurch, were growing. And increasingly, they were becoming recognized, as you can see on the right-hand side, in the global roster of increasingly important cities. Globalization was causing our cities to grow and causing them not just to have opportunities to increase jobs and productivity, but also exposing particular kinds of challenges in housing markets, in infrastructure platforms, and in the ability to service a growing population. Now, in that context, cities like Auckland and Wellington were beginning to be recognized as global leaders. They were standing out already for their quality of life, for their specialization in new technology-led businesses. They were recognized for the efforts they were making on sustainability. And they were having great momentum when it comes to thinking about a knowledge economy. Although much of their progress on knowledge economy was also fueled by international demand through international students and through international and cross-border cooperations. So when we think about COVID-19, we need to think of it in the context of the previous cycle of growth and the kinds of opportunities and challenges it was presenting. I think it makes sense to think about COVID-19 as not just a health crisis, which it clearly is, and the Prime Minister and the Mayor have already referred to that, not just an economic shock, which leads to a recession, which of course will have sorting effects, prioritizing some industries and downgrading others, prioritizing some nations and downgrading others, and of course prioritizing some cities and downgrading others. But we must think about COVID-19 not just as a health crisis and as a recession, but of course also as an agent of change. Now, when you think of it as an agent of change, it's essential, I think, to do two things simultaneously. The first one is to recognize that it has very distinctive phases to it. The first phase of pandemic management, which many countries are now coming through, and where New Zealand has excelled, is marked slightly unevenly by the introduction of a vaccine or by the achievement of net zero, as it were, cases. But it's also marked rather more by a set of other changes that are occurring, which we see much more in the recovery. And when we think about when pandemic management moves to recovery and then to reset, we need to have our eyes not just on the health crisis itself, but on other geopolitical shifts, technological developments, and wider things that have happened in the global economic system. So what would be wrong is to think that the pandemic is over when we have no more cases, but also it would be wrong to think about that we can extrapolate, as it were, from the pandemic management period, a whole series of things that might go on in the future. Anyone like me who digests the global media at the moment will be very aware that there are many predictions of the death of cities or the end of CBDs. Many of those predictions come from the United States. At the same time, if you look at what's happening in China and other parts of Asia Pacific, especially some of the larger cities in Northeast Asia, you will see that they're far from the death of cities. We're already experiencing a new kind of resurgence. So it's important, I think, not to extrapolate from one phase lessons that you think will be long-term. Now, when we think about the long-term effects of COVID-19 as an agent of change, perhaps we can say that 6 particular imperatives have been revealed as being critical in terms of their capacity to change the kinds of economies and communities that we have. Very quickly, the first one of these is to do with trade and supply chains, where what COVID-19 has done is to prove that all sorts of supply chains and trade platforms that have been focused on efficiency may not have been sufficiently resilient to deal with the kind of crisis that we've faced. And as a consequence, many nations, many companies, many industries and sectors are reworking their trade and supply plans in order to create more optionality, in order to create greater resilience, and to focus much more on using data and digital capability to manage trade and supply better. There are big opportunities in all of this for the reworking of city and regional economies. The second big area of change that COVID-19 has highlighted is, of course, the massive uptick in technology, in digitization, and in the as-a-service business models that have come from it. As we've already heard very well, I think, from Andrew and others, what technology has done is to change our relationship both to services, to places, to spaces, and to products, creating, as it were, a completely new kind of logistics industry, but at the same time having the power to reorganize both demand and supply in things like medicine, in education, in culture, in entertainment, and in retail. So whilst we may be happy about the opportunity to have a more customer-centric focus, we must wonder about the impact of digitization, for example, on international tourism or international higher education. A third big area of change from COVID-19, of course, is about the revealed challenges in health and well-being and the inequalities and inadequacies of the systems that have been revealed. Now, New Zealand, of course, has been a world champion in this space, but many other countries have discovered, much to their surprise, that certain populations have been much more disadvantaged than others by COVID-19, and it has revealed, as it were, an inadequacy in the health services, particularly in things like testing and tracing and other kinds of laboratory-based activities that have led to a call for a new settlement in healthcare and in health infrastructure into the future. The big uptick in digitization, of course, is creating a completely new market in digitized medicine and in remote medicine and everything that happens in relation to how doctors provide their services. A fourth big area, of course, is to do with planet and climate change. The link between human health and planetary health has been solidly made during this period of the pandemic. On the one hand, the origins of the pandemic are to do with the disruption of the food chain with the animal kingdom. On the other hand, of course, people with pre-existing respiratory conditions have been more prone to the virus and are often, they have those conditions because of their exposure to poor air quality. And of course, the experience of lockdown has been, to one extent, a kind of accidental experiment in decoupling productivity from carbon emissions in such a way that we can say it's possible to have much more productive economies, but not to produce so much carbon at the same time. If you like, we've proved to ourselves that this is possible. The fifth big area of change is to do with politics. It's the relationship between citizens and governments, where trust, where security, where new kinds of regulations and laws have been introduced. New Zealand has, as you know, enjoyed a very high level of trust and cooperation between citizens and governments, but this has not been universally true around the world. And for many, this is the incursion of the state into the life of the citizen. And at the same time, we have seen national governments move away somewhat from multilateral arrangements. The big trade deal agreed last week for Asia Pacific, of course, is good news in this regard. But that trade deal stands out as being one of the very few multilateral agreements to have survived this pandemic. And we see somewhat a retreat into competitive nationalism. Now, the sixth big area of change we might call a new social contract. There are many dimensions to this. On the one hand, as the health scare has revealed so much inequality and so much inadequacy, there's a move towards much greater addressing of inequality moving forward. On the other hand, the big uptick in technology and digitized platforms gives rise to all sorts of questions about taxation, what is fair taxation and how that works. And of course, the rise in the climate agenda gives rise to, indeed, a new kind of license to operate for businesses within our economy. This new social contract also brings with it some questions about public finances, how we tax, where we generate revenue, what we borrow for, where we invest, how we pay for infrastructure becomes a critical issue in this new social contract that will emerge post-COVID. So these six ideas taken together seem to me to represent some of the longer term implications of COVID that we need to think about as we move forward. And in their own way, they produce a set of new questions about population and jobs. Where will the population settle? How will we create the new jobs? They raise some important questions about settlement patterns, cities and regions and places, which I'll come on to speak about. But they also raise very large issues about utilities and infrastructure and real estate and how agile they're able to be in reconfiguring themselves towards the new world that we will face. You see, from the point of view of the rest of the world looking at New Zealand, it's very important that New Zealand has been so successful in creating this demonstration of how to manage a pandemic of this kind. But the key question must be, what does this do to the demand side profile of New Zealand's trading partners? And how successful will they be in producing the customers that New Zealand needs into the future? Now, to pick up on those issues, I want to really tackle three issues very quickly. One is to do with climate, a second one is to do with technology, and the third one is to do with economies. We know very well that in the Paris Agreement, it was recognized that a 0.5 rise in sea levels would be catastrophic for the world. And that's why it was agreed that 2 degrees maximum of global warming would be the target. You can see here on my chart the vast range of the world's cities that are threatened by a rise in sea levels above 0.5 meters by 2050. And you can see, of course, where you are in this picture. Because of this extreme now anxiety about sea level rises and its link to climate change, we see many cities embracing a net zero carbon agenda. And New Zealand cities, of course, are leaders in this. And to embrace net zero carbon, there's a fundamental challenge to revise and to reform the business models for infrastructure. These, of course, are to do with energy, the shift from the sources of energy. They're to do particularly with transportation, the electrification and integration of infrastructure. They're to do very, very deeply with real estate and construction, turning buildings into net energy producers, thinking about low carbon materials, and of course eliminating waste, optimizing the way that logistics perform, and thinking much more deeply about water consumption and indeed water recycling and reuse. So the net zero carbon city agenda is an infrastructure agenda that brings with it not just a requirement for new incentives, new ways of investing, new forms of regulation. It also brings a requirement to rework business models so that they're able to deliver the outcome and at the same time be sustainable in their own way. Now, this links very carefully to the whole idea that we need to focus on net zero, not just as an agenda to address climate change, but also as an economic strategy, as a livability strategy, net zero as a social and innovation strategy, a way, if you like, of reaping the multiple benefits and thinking about how to capture value from the net zero pathway and to use that to finance infrastructure in reworked business models as we move forward. This brings us very clearly to the second topic of technology, the recognition that we are in the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, but that age has just been vastly accelerated in all new kinds of ways because of COVID-19. What this leads to is a recognition that, if you like, infrastructure has become a digitized service. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see all the different ways in which the new technologies that are being accelerated by the pandemic are changing the way that our infrastructure systems work and requiring them not just to be more efficient, but to be much more agile and to embrace forms of hybridity they didn't have before. At the same time, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how digitization is reworking our economies to produce a new set of job creation opportunities. One way of thinking about those is to start to recognize that the new jobs in our economy will come from the interface between previously separated sectors that are beginning to become much more integrated because of the functions that technology places. This is not least true in the area of the systems and services economy, sometimes called urban services, and in the circular economy. But it's also true in the experience economy. We see new technologies rapidly eroding the barriers between these separate sectors and creating opportunities for much more interdependence, much more new job creation, and new models of enterprise emerging through these new supercluster processes. Now, when we think about this economy more generally, we can see that there's been a global consensus about sectors that have been negatively impacted on the left versus those that have been positively impacted on the right. We can see the degree of certainty at the top and the degree of uncertainty at the bottom. So we can see that certain traditional sectors like aviation and travel, or restaurants and hospitality, a high level of confidence that they will decline, but also a desire to see them find their right size and their new structure, their new symmetry. Now, in order to do that, of course, we need to recognize that market sentiment has followed these predictions, and we can see which sectors in the economy are predicted to decline, which ones are predicted to grow, but also the enormous response that came in the last 10 days as news of the progress in vaccines reached all of us in one way or another. As you can see in my very simple slide here, on the left-hand side, 3 different kinds of medical intervention. On the right-hand side, sectors of the economy that will be enabled if we're able to have these interventions. A widely available vaccine, comprehensively applied in multiple parts of the world, is absolutely critical to picking up our urban services, our real estate, our hotels, our travel, and indeed our international higher education, our conventions, our conferences, and so many things that are a critical part of the New Zealand economy. These things will only come back to some kind of new normal when we have a complete response to the pandemic, but they will have within them the carried behaviors of the first period of the pandemic, the increased digitization and the reworked business models. So we expect to see a hybrid system emerging from all of this. This is perhaps best summarised by having a quick look at the real estate sector. Here you have on the left-hand side a set of sectors and subsectors and indeed locations where there's an expectation of growth. You have in the middle a set of sectors where there's a widespread expectation of some decline, although not full and not permanent decline. And then you have a great degree of uncertainty in these yellow sectors, and you can see what the challenges are that they will face as we move forward. Now, thinking about this in a longer term way, we can begin to talk about where New Zealand might be headed next. On this chart, you can see various different diagrams that represent different kinds of settlement patterns where infrastructure is an enabler of where people live and the choices that they make. At the beginning of the 1980s, when this century of the city began, New Zealand cities found themselves in boxes 1 and 2, essentially growing and densifying. But what COVID-19 will be is an accelerator of moves towards boxes 6 and 7 and 8 and possibly 9, as we will see overlapping housing markets and labour markets, with many of New Zealand's cities having new opportunities within them for people to live in distinctive locations and work in others. One way of describing this is to talk about the arrival of the blended city, a city where we combine the best of the physical amenities and attributes of the cities we know and love, coupled with the virtual city with all the benefits of digitization. But what this leads to is not just a new set of choices for citizens, but a series of leadership and investment challenges where infrastructure, I believe, will be most critically exposed. Taking this to the nth degree, we could say that we could ask the question, how will COVID-19 change house prices in New Zealand? Will it be the case, for example, that the places that have been highly inflated will simply spread out into broader regional geographies and people will live in all parts of both islands whilst having jobs in another part of the country? Or will we see New Zealand increasingly integrate with the housing markets of Australia or with ASEAN, so that people who only have to travel 1 or 2 or 3 times a month may decide to live in New Zealand and work elsewhere? And what does that mean for our taxation system and how we capture value? All of these questions, I think, arise from a long-term perspective on COVID-19. So to conclude, we've identified that there's a set of key first-order issues associated with the virus that will have a long-term effect on the way our economies and our societies emerge. These create both opportunities and threats, as the Prime Minister said earlier, but they also have within them very significant implications for infrastructure and how it relates to resilience, how infrastructure is an enabler of the path to net zero, how infrastructure can now serve a revised set of settlement patterns, how infrastructure couples with digitization to create a new as-a-service set of infrastructures, and of course these long-term financial models that are going to be required in an environment where value is created differently, where value is captured differently, and where value has become much more mobile. Thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you this morning. I wish you every success with the rest of your conference.
Round of applause, please, for Professor Greg Cloud. All right, everyone. As you'll be aware, Infrastructure NZ has been upping the dial on the sustainability front at Building Nations. So to reduce waste, you are asked to pre-order your gala dinner meal ahead of time. The WT Partnership lanyards have been sanitised and reused. All of our theming decorations will be returned and recycled at the depots and are filled with nuts and bolts instead of cable ties, and we're using reusable crockery throughout the 2 days and have practically eliminated single-use items. So we're very excited about that. Please support our sustainability efforts by separating your waste and ensuring you drop your lanyard in the recycling bins at the exit at the conclusion of this symposium. All right, everyone, it's time to listen now to a conversation between Sharon Zollner, Chief Economist at ANZ, and Caralee, McLeish, Secretary to the Treasury, with an economic outlook and the government's response to it. A round of applause, please.
She's up all night to the zone. I'm up all night to get some. She's up all night for good fun. I'm up all night to get lucky. We're up all night to the sun. We're up all night to get some. We're up all night for good fun.
All right, well, as we've heard, these are not normal times. I think it's fair to say that as economists, we're all struggling with what has been the weirdest recession ever. And yet, things are obviously quite extreme. We've had the biggest fall in GDP in measured history. We've got the pandemic raging overseas and lockdowns being reimposed across much of the Northern Hemisphere. Our border is closed. Tourism has been wiped out. It was as big a foreign exchange earner as dairy before this happened. Huge disruption to shipping in and out, and air freight, of course. And the uncertainty is hard to overstate. As was mentioned late last week, we weren't even sure if we could hold this event. So pretty difficult times for businesses to plan ahead. And yet there's an aura of bulletproof about this economy. People seem to be feeling extremely confident. The housing market is booming. Business sentiment around investment intentions and employment and exports and own activity, all back where they were last year. You ask firms what their biggest problems are, and they say the same problems as last year, which is quite remarkable, led by finding skilled staff. So I think it's probably fair to say that much of the world would love to have our problems at the moment. But it's a very uncertain picture, so how is Treasury seeing the outlook?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon, and good to chat, and tēnā koutou katoa. So we have a very similar view at the Treasury to some of the main directions that you've just outlined. I mean, I'll make 3 points about the outlook. And the first one is that economic data continues to come in consistent with our more optimistic scenarios. New Zealand's had a very successful public health response, and so we've had less time in lockdown than was originally anticipated. We've also had success in the economic response, with more workers kept in jobs and more businesses kept afloat through the shock. I think we've seen a lot more resilience across a range of different indicators, from employment data to business confidence. And there's good news also in the last week or so with developments in vaccines. And while that's not changing our forecasts at the Treasury, it does provide a little more confidence that there is a way out of the pandemic. But second point is that despite that, good news, and it is good news, we need to remember that the economy has experienced the sharpest contraction on record. We've had a drop of 12.2% in GDP in the June quarter. Just to put that in perspective, the next largest drop was 2.4% in the early 1990s. And there's just still significant uncertainty about the outlook. And we think that many of the costs of the pandemic are yet to flow through the economy. So international tourism is seasonal. We're yet to enter the peak season. Some economic supports are unwinding, and we see further lockdowns in the US, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, and that will also flow through to New Zealand through trade and through confidence channels. So our view is that we expect unemployment will continue to rise, although not by as much as we thought back earlier in the days of the pandemic. We also think that it will take until probably 2022 until GDP recovers to pre-COVID levels. That's about the same amount of time it took in the GFC. And we do think it's likely there'll be some economic scarring, so we'll have probably a permanent reduction in the trajectory of GDP growth. And look, and the third point to make is just how uneven the impacts of COVID-19 have been right across the economy. So we see retail and accommodation businesses that have been hit particularly hard. And on the other hand, financial services is growing. Agriculture, public sector remains relatively robust. Some people, particularly young people, low-skilled workers, have been also hit particularly hard, and there is some evidence also women and Māori have been disproportionately impacted. And so that's really important in thinking through how we understand what sort of economic support is required to reach the people who are most affected.
Yeah, and I think the unevenness of the shock does go a long way to explain some of the weirdness that we're seeing. Like in our consumer confidence survey, we ask people, is it a good time to buy a major household item? So should I borrow $500 to buy a fridge at the moment? And that has really good correlation with retail sales. And at the moment, people are saying, no, the world's too uncertain. But then you ask them, is it a good time to buy a house? That's the ASB survey. And people go, heck yeah, best time since 2012. I'm really keen to borrow $500,000. So maybe we've got a whole lot of houses with no appliances in them. It's actually possible given the shipping disruptions we're seeing at the moment. But I think it's more likely to reflect that there are many people who have been completely unaffected by this. Their income's secure, they've got a bit of wealth and deciding what to do with it, and money is practically free. But there are others who have really been walloped quite hard by this. So I do think that does speak to a particular role for fiscal policy, whereas obviously monetary is quite broad brush. So how is Treasury thinking about the economic response now?
I should be clear at the outset that policy decisions are a matter for government, of course, and Treasury's role is to advise on that. I mean, it was very clear early on in the pandemic that a swift and strong response was needed, and on a scale at which none of us were really used to in working in fiscal policy for quite some time. I mean, I think, like for many others, it was an incredibly intense time at the Treasury. You know, other countries postponed their budgets, and we kind of had a rolling succession of them. And I do think it's some of the toughest and also the most meaningful work that we've done. And I want to take the opportunity just to give a bit of a shout out to the team, because there are some in the audience there for some of the great work that they did. But look, the initial response was very much about helping workers to remain in jobs and helping businesses to stay afloat. And what we've seen is, I think, the government's wages subsidy has been particularly successful in achieving that. And I think it's worth noting also for this audience that the construction sector had some of the highest take-up rates of the wages subsidy, and it's also had some of the fastest bounce backs in terms of economic activity. But what remains a case at the start of the pandemic, and is the case now, is that core to the economic response was the public health response. So we can look to other countries to see what happens when the virus gets out of control. And in New Zealand, we had initially a stricter lockdown than many other countries, but that also enabled a faster return to normality. So at the Treasury, we continue now to work closely with our health colleagues in thinking about the economic response and understanding how we can control the virus in a way that helps to still maximise safe economic activity. But in addition to the public health response, the economic response also has fiscal policy at the centre. We think ongoing fiscal support is critical to the recovery. Treasury has a historic amount of spending that's built into our forecasts. And government has been clear that it will spend more from the COVID fund, spend some of the unallocated COVID funds if it needs to. So we're watching the economy evolve very closely, and I think it's very important for policy to be nimble. Wouldn't surprise you to hear us say as a Treasury that also value for money in fiscal policy is incredibly important. We think that spending needs to deliver not just benefits in the short term, fiscal stimulus, but also long-term gains. As the Prime Minister said earlier this morning, it's about building back better and taking the opportunity to address some of the long-standing challenges that New Zealand faces: productivity, sustainability, and equity. And here I think that infrastructure really has a strong role to play. Infrastructure projects provide jobs and income in the short term, but infrastructure projects can also lead to investments that last for a long time, deliver benefits for productivity, help our cities, our places become more resilient, and lead to better wellbeing outcomes as well.
That all sounds great, but can we afford it?
Yeah, so I remember when I first started at the Treasury, it was about a year ago, and I remember very clearly that net debt to GDP at that time was 19.2%. Seems like a very long time ago now. We expect over the next 4 years it'll be more than 50%. But our view at the Treasury is that those levels of debt are manageable. So bond costs are really low, and they're expected to remain low for some time. We have good market access and a really active investor base. And despite the increases in debt, New Zealand, compared to many other countries that we benchmark ourselves with, still is on the low side. So you see many countries in the OECD with levels of debt to GDP at more than 100%. So rather than focusing in on the levels of debt, our view is that it's more important at this point to focus on value for money from that debt. So it is possible to get benefits to spending now for current generations as well as future generations that outweigh the costs if we have spending that does address some of the long-standing challenges that the economy faces. And also in thinking about debt, we need to think about sustainability as well. At this point, large deficits are needed to support the economy, large temporary deficits. But as always, we need to make sure that we maintain discipline on underlying revenue and expenses, and make sure that we can still manage to manage through some of the significant cost pressures that all government faces, like rising health costs and changing demographics, climate change, and so on.
It's extremely unfashionable to worry about debt at the moment, globally. There does seem to be an increasing consensus that governments can and should spend at will, funded by printing money, perhaps even direct monetary financing. So cut out the middle guy, save some money for the taxpayer, and just print. I think Indonesia announced they were going to directly finance 30% of their deficit this year, and markets yawned. So free money. What's Treasury's view on that?
Yeah, well, sadly, and we've looked carefully at this, but sadly, we really just don't think there's any free lunch there. So under monetary financing, of course, the government sells bonds to the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank buys those bonds and issues settlement cash. So as you say, it's effectively government printing money and then spending it. But what's important to remember is that that settlement cash, it sits on the balance sheet of the Crown as a liability in the same way that government bonds do, and we have to pay interest on settlement cash in the same way as we pay interest on government bonds. Settlement cash is part of net debt in the same way as government bonds are part of net debt. So in effect, really, monetary financing is just swapping one type of liability, government bonds, for another type of liability, which is settlement cash. So look, I mean, that's all a bit technical, but I think that the key thing to remember is that monetary financing it's just not a magical source of free funding. And, in fact, it comes with some real downsides. So, it blurs fiscal and monetary policy. It can erode the independence of inflation targeting, and that can lead to higher inflation. And it can erode fiscal discipline, and that can lead to poorer quality spend. And in fact, what the Reserve Bank is doing now with its quantitative easing program, the large-scale asset purchases, actually has a very similar effect on the balance sheet to monetary financing, but without the same sorts of costs to economic institutions. And New Zealand, of course, has a long and proud tradition of really strong economic institutions, and we think that's important to maintain. So, right now we really see monetary and fiscal policy working in tandem together, effectively to support the recovery.
And I think you can see from what's happened since that first lockdown and how the second lockdown barely dented things, that monetary and fiscal policy have worked extremely well this year. But of course there is increasing debate about the channels through which monetary policy works in particular. And when businesses are nervous and the world is so uncertain, investment plans do tend to go on hold, whereas households tend to throw caution to the wind. And so we have this unprecedented situation of a housing boom at a time of a real negative income shock. And I think there's increasing concern about both the societal and the potential financial implications of that. But at least one thing I think everybody agrees on is that New Zealand does have an infrastructure deficit, and this is a great opportunity to address that. So how is Treasury thinking about the role of infrastructure in particular in this recovery?
Yep. So government has a $42 billion infrastructure program, and that is really providing a large boost to the economy as it recovers from the downturn. Timely delivery is really important in the recovery, and we've been supporting our minister in monitoring progress. But I think that the disruption of COVID has, it's provided an opportunity to really focus in on some of the changes to our infrastructure system that are already underway, but there's an opportunity to kind of accelerate and focus in on those more. So three that the Treasury is most interested in. And first is just the importance of long-term and integrated strategies to guide infrastructure planning and delivery. And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at the Infrastructure Commission for the great work that they're doing in really building up a 30-year national strategy for infrastructure. And at the next level down, integrated spatial planning across different levels of government and integrating different sectors. That's also going to be really critical to getting well-planned infrastructure and getting better well-being outcomes. I think the example of housing affordability is a good one here. Integrated spatial planning can really help to increase housing supply and relieve some of the pressure on house prices. But the second area of focus for Treasury and infrastructure is really robust project selection. So there I mean rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and Treasury uses its living standards framework to assess infrastructure projects as well. So that's really recognising that infrastructure delivers not just the physical asset, but it actually helps to promote environmental outcomes, social and human capital as well. Infrastructure can help to manage risk, in particular looking at resilience to climate change. And infrastructure can also affect distribution and equity across the economy. And I think, again, the example of infrastructure for housing is a good one, where infrastructure in the right place can really help to support housing markets. So we need to look at all of those different dimensions and make sure that it's projects that have the highest net benefit that are the ones that are funded. And the third area of focus for Treasury in infrastructure is really looking at the enablers of the system. And so for that, regulatory settings are key. For example, the proposed Resource Management Act reforms are likely to have a significant impact on infrastructure systems, again, including housing markets. And I think the experience that we've had during the pandemic with the fast track process in the RMA has shown that there's some real benefits from reform in that area. Other enablers, workforce, skills development, and infrastructure funding and financing are very much on Treasury's radar. And we've done quite a bit of work in infrastructure financing. For example, Treasury played a key role in some of the changes that have enabled councils to borrow for infrastructure using future revenue streams. So there's more that we engage on in infrastructure than that, but there's sort of a selection of the issues that are really important to us. It's fantastic to see that a lot of those issues are topics for the next 2 days in this forum, and so we're really looking forward to participating and hearing some really constructive discussion on those issues.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Well, thank you to Sharon Zollner and Caralee McLeish. Optimistic outlook given our swift and strong response to COVID, although reminding us that there is unevenness in the shock and the implications of that, and looking to infrastructure to not only rebuild, but reminding us of the power we have to help address inequities going forward, and of course acknowledging the infrastructure deficit and how we work within and despite that. So it's wonderful to have Treasury's Caralee McLeish, her economic outlook and government response, and thanks too to our facilitator, ANZ Sharon Zollner. Another round of applause, please. Now, as you may be aware, every year Infrastructure New Zealand chooses a charity to support as part of the Building Nations legacy. This year, Mates in Construction was selected, and we are delighted to welcome Gloria and Victoria to the stage to share the incredible work that the team has been leading to reduce suicide and address mental health issues in the construction industry. Please welcome them.
Watch out! How you hit the floor? How you hit the floor? 63 Impala, baby, you don't wanna know. How you hit the floor?
Kia ora, everybody. I'm Gloria Vitakina from Mates in Construction Aotearoa. I just want to say thank you to Infrastructure New Zealand for sponsoring us to be here today. So I don't know if you know anything about us, but Mates in Construction runs programs within the construction industry, specifically around suicide prevention, mental health and well-being. So we're actually going to run a short video, and we're not sure where everyone is sitting with around suicide today, but if today is not your day, please feel free to exit the room for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, we've got some amazing staff here that are dressed up as amazingly as me, with this wonderful visor gear get up on, who's available to help you out or answer any questions. Thank you.
A pledge to rebuild the construction industry.
Labor already plans to build 8,000 more state houses.
A $15 million revamp which will help reduce on-site build times to less than 2 months.
Building is tough work, and life can sometimes also be tough for those in the industry, as this construction manager knows well.
He was getting up at dawn and working till dusk to try and get the job done, and still couldn't keep his head above water, and unfortunately he committed suicide from it.
Construction in Aotearoa is the leading industry for suicide. A construction worker is 6 times more likely to die by suicide than in a workplace accident. And 52% of those have no history of mental illness. Suicide prevention needs a whole of industry approach. We can all influence the future. We need leadership. What are you doing about it?
Kia ora, everybody. So Mates in Construction was established last year. It was for industry, by industry. Our evidence-based program is very much research-focused. We know we've got a problem here in New Zealand. We're losing too many people to suicide every year, and it's our industry that's contributed to this. But as an industry, we know that we can work together to solve this problem. Working together, we can change behaviours right across industry. This includes everybody in this room, because suicide is everybody's business. We need a top-down approach, as well as what we do on site, building capacity for our people. We need your support, and this programme needs your help. Mates needs funding, and we need to be able to expand this programme and grow to cover the whole of Aotearoa. So again, we need your help to get out there. We need to reach everyone in our great industry right across the whole of New Zealand. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Gloria and Victoria from the amazing charity Mates in Construction. Suicide is everyone's business, they say, and of course that is an important message, a powerful one. We do want to acknowledge anyone in this room that has been affected, either on a personal or professional level, by this. Do take a moment to visit Gloria and Victoria's booth in the exhibition hall during the conference, and please another round of applause for Mates in Construction. Now, a couple of other matters. For those of you who have attended Building Nations before, you will know that you need to pace yourself. It's a big program today, followed by the Infrastructure New Zealand cocktail party, followed by the BNZ Gala dinner, followed by the after party, sponsored by Anderson Lloyd, across the road at the Hangar Bar. So don't just pace yourself, look after yourself. We're going to help you do that. You all have 2 Uber discount vouchers, and there are shuttle buses available, so please make sure that you look after each other and get home safely. While you're here, if you need a quiet spot to get some work done, just pop into the Buddle Finley Business Centre, which has everything that you'll need for an office away from the office. For those of you who need caffeinating, Please call into the ANZ Fletcher's and Fulton Hogan barista bars operating in the exhibition hall, and if coffee is not your thing, try one of the fresh juices from the RCR Fresh Juice Bar. We have a new app and polling system this year, Te whānau, so I'm going to ask Andrea Rickard from our technology sponsor Beca to teach us how to use them. Welcome, Andrea.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm smiling because I've never seen a chandelier made out of orange traffic cones before. 850 people here today. That's a real treat to be able to have that. To be able to have 800 infrastructure leaders from across Aotearoa. We're in an incredibly privileged position here, being future focused and being able to genuinely influence the look and feel of the future and our future generations and how they'll experience the environments in which they live, work and play. Back in early March, I was still convinced I was going to Europe at the end of the month, and I think it all changed in a matter of a few days. I was sitting in a restaurant on a Friday. There were a few rumours and whispers, which I generally tend to give a wide berth, but these ones did seem to be getting a lot louder. We at Beca had done a few working from home tests. We'd started rolling out Teams. We had a few other tools that we were rolling out a lot quicker than we might have usually. And then the following Monday, we all knew Alert Level 4 was coming. I reflect on the heroes of the past year, and the ones that come to mind are still the small family businesses that stuck it out, and they did it hard. I think about the bakery on Karangahape Road that delivered us delicious bread and gave me some sourdough tips. The local butcher, they all pivoted their businesses going online. We even had a local wine bar that delivered us platter food. I really focused myself on buying locally from small businesses, even more so than I usually do. Remember the supermarket workers, the pharmacy staff, the medical staff, essential road workers, infrastructure workers, they all became our superheroes. And the IT people in our offices, they were the unsung heroes. I don't know about you, but I don't know what magic the Beca IT team did in the background, but they really were the superheroes that transformed our business in a matter of only a few days, enabling us all to continue pretty much seamlessly. It was a pretty amazing feat. Why do I reflect on this now? As 800 infrastructure leaders, it is now our turn. It's our turn to provide leadership as we embark on one of the largest infrastructure investments in recent history. I don't know how many times I've heard, and I've actually said it myself, that this year has been a resilience test. So we have a chance now to reset and use this opportunity to build back better. It's quite daunting, it's quite hard, especially as we are facing real complexity, an ever-changing world, and challenges like climate change, urbanisation, inequality and digitisation. And we have a choice. We can do it together. With this year being our 100th anniversary at Beca, we are delighted to be supporting the ReBuilding Nations Symposium as Golden Technology Partner and sponsor of the Data and Digital session tomorrow. We've spent 100 years involved in shaping our country, and our footprints are all over this whenua. We want to get real about this and those aspirational outcomes for our people and our communities. So it is my pleasure to introduce the polling for the symposium, which you will see captures these aspirational themes. The polls are held every year as part of the event and are designed to capture sentiments of the industry. It is easy to think of infrastructure as pipes, tracks, blacktop, hospitals, but ultimately it's all about people. So I encourage you to remember those superheroes I talked about, those people in our communities when you're answering the questions. So this is your chance to be heard on the issues and priorities that will impact on all of our futures. For those of you who haven't done it already, the app can be downloaded from the Apple App Store for iPhone users and the Google Play Store for Android users. It is super easy to find. Just Google, search for ReBuilding Nations, just type that in and it'll pop up. So you'll need to sign in using your email address, and the instructions are up there on the screen now. So once you have signed into the app, you'll see your schedule, your personalised schedule ready and waiting for you. To participate in the polls, you can select from the current session. So just click on the session and from your schedule, and then you'll be able to take the poll as directed. And you will see live results displayed on a screen as they're coming in, and there is a test poll that's up and running now, so you're able to go into that and do that right now. There's 2 questions in there. There's actually a test question, and then there's the first question for the whole symposium. So when you're ready, please do open it and choose the welcome poll. It's really easy. So thanks everybody, and remember that there will be a chance to answer a question after every session, and please do check that app regularly. So after this, you'll be pleased to know it is time for some kawhi and kai, and I look forward to meeting some of you shortly. Looking forward to meeting some new faces and some people that I've met before. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Yes, so we've been through a year of votes and polls, haven't we? So a little more can't hurt. We do encourage you to have your say in the polls, which will be running, as Andrea says, at the end of each session. We promise we'll have those results back to you quickly. We won't keep you in suspense. You can also find a delegate there, and if you check back later in the afternoon, you'll find your table number for the gala dinner tonight. Now, a few acknowledgements. We'd like to thank our stationery sponsor for the notebooks they've made available. Thank you also to Rawlinson's, a former Best Exhibition booth winner, for their Shoe Shine booth. Go and get your shoes shined. And a big thank you to our live stream sponsors, Stantec, who have supported us to go online this year, and also to our workshop sponsors who will be kicking into action after morning tea. A round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we have a couple of tasks for you. Every year we run the Best Exhibition Booth competition, so have a look around, see who's done a great job, and we'll ask you to vote tomorrow at lunchtime. Also, we're going to be running a Best Keynote Speaker competition, so take note and cast your vote again at midday tomorrow. Morning tea is soon, but do check where you're going after morning tea, as we're breaking into 3 sessions. The infrastructure pipeline session will remain in this room with me, and those interested in climate change, resilience and sustainability will be heading upstairs into the Genesis room on level 2. For those who have registered, and only those who have registered for the Kāinga Ora workshop, please go to the Heron room, also located on level 2. In the meantime, please enjoy your morning tea, courtesy of Marsh, and we will be getting underway again at 10:40 sharp. We really need you to hit that mark, ladies and gentlemen, so that we can get through the whole day's events and get you off to your parties later on this evening. Last, a round of applause, please, for all of our speakers so far this morning. We'll see you at 10:40.
shirt. I don't know what happens to me. I know it's real and I still believe. I can dance away the rain, real happy for the wind. Do the things that my way, sing and swing and my day. I can swing entire 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 day. Swing it. Swing entire day. Swing entire day. I go out and I break a heel. Show I played and I lose the deal. Do my hair and it starts to rain. It might be life, but it's all a game. I can dance away the rain, real happy for the wind. Do the things that my way, sing and swing entire day. I can swing entire
plan.